Never sure, I was talking to our speaker, I'm never sure post-COVID who's going to come to a Socratic Club meeting, but I'm very glad you're here. The Gonzaga Socratic Club just celebrated its 20-year anniversary last year, which is a real milestone. But the club is not a club in the ordinary sense. I joke with people we don't have a secret handshake or a hazing ritual or anything like that. But the club gets its name from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was an organization on the Oxford campus in the mid-1900s that was presided over by famous Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis. And it was started because students were looking for, at that time, Oxford was full of student organizations that catered to just about every specialization and interest of all kinds. But there wasn't really a group where students could explore philosophical and religious topics in a way that brought a lot of people of different views together. And so they actually named it the Socratic Club because of Socrates' motto in the Republic, I believe, where he says that he wants to follow the truth wherever it leads, and that means you gather people together and you have a conversation. So the Socratic Club at Oxford in the mid-1900s was a place where lots of famous philosophers and theologians and scientists gathered together, and I'm afraid we don't manage to get some of the super people, but we get wonderful people. So I'm very glad that we have our speaker here today. The Socratic Club here at Oxford does try to, the way I describe what we're all about is that we explore Christian worldview issues from a broadly philosophical point of view, having to do with questions like truth and evil and goodness and human nature and all those sorts of things. And so that's what the club is all about. If you're interested and would like to know about future events, we have a nice slate of events for the fall. Just do a Google search on Gonzaga Socratic Club and you'll find us. And there is an email list served that you can sign up for if you want to be apprised of events as they're occurring. Our speaker tonight is an instructor of philosophy at Community Colleges of Spokane, teaching general courses including history of philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of religion, critical thinking, symbolic logic, and philosophy of mind. He was just saying that he likes the quarter system at Spokane Community College because it gives him lots of chance to do different things, and the list shows that. Before coming to Spokane, he was assistant professor of philosophy at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, and held various teaching appointments. Before that, he earned his BA degree from University of Oregon, an MA from St. John's College, and an MA and PhD degrees from Duquesne University. The talk today is titled, Why do we do what we believe to be bad? The question we're going to ask is really a question about ethical motivation and why it is that even when we know something to be morally suspect, problematic, outright bad, we find ourselves doing it anyway. So welcome Geoff Bagwell, please.
Thank you, Professor Calhoun. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the Philosophy Department and the Socratic Society for hosting this event. I look forward to talking to you. One thing I wanted to mention before I start is I am losing my hearing in my left ear. So as we talk, I might ask you to repeat yourself because I miss certain letters of the alphabet when people are talking to me. So just please bear that in mind as we go. So the title of the talk, right? Why do we do things sometimes that we know are bad, is I hope why you guys all showed up, or at least it was intriguing enough for you guys to bother to come today. So I wanted to start by just asking you to take a moment and just think on your own, what maybe one or two examples of things in your life, if there are any, that you would say are examples of doing something you thought was wrong or believed was bad, but you went ahead and did it anyway. And by the way, don't bare your soul in public. I'm just wanting you to think about it for a moment. Got one? Okay. Maybe that was too easy or too hard. I don't know. Okay, now what I'd like you to do now is think in the same terms, but I would like you to consider what example maybe looms in your mind of a time when you observed some other person doing something that you thought was wrong and you believed they thought was wrong, but went ahead and did it anyway. Does that make sense? Can you think of an example? Again, you don't have to shout it out. Got one? Okay. Any bold souls? Anyone want to share?
Which, first question or second question?
The second one. I don't want you guys to go too personal. But if you could think of an example of some time when you saw someone else do something that you thought they knew was wrong or bad, and then went ahead and did it anyway, what can you give me? And if you don't have anything, that's okay. Yeah?
Yeah, the one I think of most obvious is shoplifting, seeing somebody shoplifting.
Okay. And you've observed this yourself. What's your name, brother?
Don.
Don. Thank you. Okay. Shoplifting. You've seen somebody else seen somebody else steal something, and presumably they knew that what they were doing was wrong, or at least you believed that they knew what they were doing was wrong. Anyone else? Yeah, what's your name?
Nick.
Nick, okay, Nick, please.
Yeah, just like driving recklessly on a freeway.
Okay.
Like cutting in front of people and going super fast.
Okay. How many of you have sped? Everybody raise your hand. Okay, but did you think it was wrong? This is a great example. Did you think it was bad to do that? Yeah. I do it all the time. Okay. And somebody else? Yes, what's your name?
Also Nick.
Also Nick.
Yeah.
Nick and Nick. Okay, that's going to be tough. Go ahead.
Someone who was not handicapped parking in a handicapped spot.
Ooh. How do you feel about that?
It was against my decision, but
Okay.
they were hired for it, did it anyway.
Okay. Are both of you confident that the other person knew that what they were doing was not okay?
Very much so.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I'll give you one example, and some of you, if you've taken philosophy classes, might know this example. I find this a very moving example. Many philosophers believe that there are no good arguments for eating meat. Did you know that? I'm not saying all of them did, but many philosophers, many academic philosophers, for example, believe there are no good arguments for eating meat. But what would you guess they do? They eat meat. So how, like with shoplifting, like with parking in handicapped spots, right? Like these examples, why does this happen? Why do people sometimes do things that they believe or know is bad?
Convenience.
Convenience. Can you elaborate?
Well, someone parking in a parking spot where they shouldn't parking it, will do it because it's faster.
Okay.
If someone's going to continue to eat meat, there's a lot of different factors that could push in that decision. One of them could be convenience. Of course, you might want to afford it for eat meat as opposed to
Okay.
eating goods.
Andrew, do you hear that? Yeah. What's your name?
Holden.
Holden. Thank you.
I would say another, like with eating meat, for example, I think you can think of like pleasure could be part of that.
Okay.
I think also like tradition or customary choices throughout history could affect that as well. You go to somebody's house and they're offering meat, like that, or if everybody thinks that meat is totally fine, that could change your perspective on it.
Okay. So you might go ahead. You're saying you might go ahead and eat meat if you're invited to a house where that's customary and culturally expected.
Right, or if you just grew up in a culture that's like that.
Okay. Okay.
Are we talking specifically about the meat example or the
We can talk about any of them, but yeah, the meat example for now. Yeah.
Oh,
Why do people leave me when they believe it's bad to do so? Sometimes, not everybody does. So we've heard some answers. Convenience. That makes sense of the parking example that he gave. Pleasure, that Holden gave. Why do people eat meat? Because it tastes good. Even when they believe it's bad. What's your name?
Louis.
Louis.
Fear of social sanction, like if you're not eating meat, it kind of subtly implies that like people who are eating meat are like morally deficient.
Okay. So there's a moral judgment sort of in there. You want to be superior maybe? Or not? Is that what you're getting at?
Were you saying you want to avoid the moral?
You want to avoid being judged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, there's the stereotype of the obnoxious vegan, and that people would seek to avoid that stereotype.
Okay. Why do you think they'd try to avoid that? Why would anyone care?
Well, I mean, you gotta like interact with other people all the time to get almost everything you need. So,
Okay.
you know, if people dislike you, it makes all of that harder.
Okay, so there's like a communal, this is maybe again Holden's point, cultural, but there's a need to feel included in the group. Conviviality, right? Why do people drink too much? Big open-ended question there. Sometimes it's because they want to be convivial, right? They want to be part of the group that they're with. They continue to go maybe beyond what they should. Do you guys see this? This is a real puzzle, I would submit to you. Why people who believe that certain things are wrong are sometimes found out to do them anyway. The real puzzle there is why that happens. If they believe it's wrong, wouldn't you expect them not to do it? But as you guys have heard, there's lots of reasons, and we can give many, many others for why people do it. Right? I don't personally know of any good reason why philosophers who believe that eating meat is wrong and that there's no good arguments for doing so continue to do it anyway, aside from they enjoy eating meat. Is that a good reason? So it's a puzzle. It's a real, I think, serious puzzle that we try to understand. And what I wanted to do today is just sort of suggest to you two sort of explanations for why this happens, based on some of these examples, right? The first explanation I would tell you is the prevailing explanation. And this comes all the way back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, 2,500 years ago. And the explanation here is pretty much what we've said. Pleasure. People do things they believe to be bad because it's fun, or because they're afraid of what the consequences might look like, or because they get angry, in short, because of the emotions they feel and the interest in avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure that they tend to have. Aristotle calls this weakness of will. The Greek term, if you're interested, is akrasia. We have a lack of ability when we're confronting a situation where we know or think we know what the right thing to do is or what's bad, and we have difficulty avoiding it, or some people do, because they're tempted by their feelings, or by pleasure, or by avoiding pain. So think about a couple instances of this, right? Anger. Anger is a really tough one. Why do people get angry at people they care about? If you've ever been angry at somebody you care about, why does it happen? Asher? Say again?
Because you care for that person.
Because you care for that person. That's not the answer I would have expected, but can you explain?
Oh, well, if you, so for example, if my brother was to do something to purposefully make you feel upset, that would make you feel more upset than if a stranger did it, because I care about my relationship with my brother.
Okay, so that makes you more upset.
Yeah.
Oddly. Okay, what did the rest of you think? Yeah, what's your name?
Rosa.
Rosa?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa.
I think that like a similar perspective, I'd say it's because I forget about the other emotions, I guess, and then at that moment I would just feel anger and just get mad like for what they did.
You just react to what they're doing.
Yeah, and because I forget about, oh, maybe I shouldn't be so mad, I should be nicer about it, I just get mad.
Okay. Cool.
I think anger, for me at least, from my understanding, how I thought about anger, a lot of it can come from cognitive dissonance, where I have an expectation or a thought about how things should go, and then things don't meet my expectation. And I think I forget what your name is, but to your point earlier about Asher, with like relationships, especially when there's cognitive dissonance to things that are important to you, that can be especially emotionally charged.
Okay. So why do you think that leads us to maybe overreact? You've been angry at somebody that you care about, and if you guys agree with Asher that we get more angry at people we love rather than, say, strangers, if that's true, why do we react towards people we love in that way? Why do we get more angry? Why do we still, for example, lash out? What's your name?
Ashley,
Ashley?
it might be because we feel safe, express your feelings versus a stranger.
Okay. You feel more safe and comfortable with somebody you care about. What do you mean by that? Do you mean like they'll
Like
understand why your anger?
Yeah, or
Okay.
even just like your relationship isn't going to change based off like one thing that you get angry about. Or just like it's a stranger, then that's all you know about them, so they're going to care more about that.
Okay. Anyone else?
There's a higher degree of dependence on those people for our own emotional regulation,
Okay.
as opposed to a stranger, for example.
Now the challenge here is, and this is part of Ashlyn's point, the challenge here is because we love these people, we don't want to damage our relationships with those people. And the reason I think anger is important here and why it's important to somebody like Aristotle is because when we get angry at people we care about, we are taking a risk. We're taking a risk of damaging a relationship, possibly, by reacting or behaving in a certain way. So we want to not do it, but sometimes we do it. We do it anyway because of the anger. Or at least that's what Aristotle says. Because we're angry, we don't behave in the way we believe or think we should behave toward the people we care about. Do you agree?
We usually know they'll forgive us too, as this guy was saying. We feel safer in those relationships. So we respond super honestly.
Super
about
honest.
our feelings.
Okay. Do you think that we feel justified in overreacting in those cases?
No.
We still know it's wrong, but we do it anyway, but we're okay with it because we feel like we can, I don't want to say get away with it, but the consequences may not be as bad as you think.
To be forgiven, as I said.
Right. Forgive.
We hope.
You know,
These kids hope that with their mom and dad, that's for sure. You
Yeah.
know that.
what about fear? Anyone afraid of flying and getting on an airplane? Yeah, I have a in-law who has never flown on a plane because he is deathly afraid of flying. So afraid that the one time he was on a plane when he was a young man, he had a panic attack and collapsed on the plane. And you might know people like this, but the flying is incredibly traumatic for some people, incredibly stressful. However, my guess is you all also know that flying is the safest thing you can do practically in the whole world. It's safer than driving, it's safer than most of, even just walking around in a lot of places, right? So, given that, flying is as safe as it is. I mean, just, if you need to think about that, or just think about how many airplanes are in the air currently in the world. And every day, there's 1,000 probably at any time off the ground, and none of them come down, right? In any given year, the number of flights that successfully land is so astronomically high by comparison to the ones that, the few that fail sometimes, that the chances of you ever getting in a plane accident or ever being injured in a plane are very small. You guys all understand that. Most people understand that. And yet, people are afraid of flying. Why? Yeah, what's your name?
Jacob.
Jacob?
I think it's like media sensationalization, because it's like, when you hear about the accidents, like, I think you can easily brush off like a car accident in some highway.
Okay.
But a plane that killed like over 100 people in a brutal like accident, even though it's less frequent, it's more popular and like more often on the front page of the news. It's something
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's true. Anyone else? Yeah. What's your name, John?
Carter.
Carter. Yeah.
I would also argue that control is a big part of it, because often when you walk around and driving a car, you're the one who's at the wheel, or someone you know. But when you and a bunch of other strangers go into a magical vehicle driven by another stranger, there's no control in that situation.
Okay. I see you nodding your head. Were you going to say something? So what's your name?
I was actually going to say something. My name is Kaya.
Kaya. Yeah.
I'm definitely afraid of dogs.
Okay.
My mom's afraid of flies, so she's always like, when you fly with her dog, she's not, is that like, I don't know whose dog that is and how it made me around a stranger.
Okay. Okay. In all those examples I kept hearing, even the cases of exaggerated media blitzing of airplane crashes, it's still fear, right? So just keep that in the back of your head. This is Aristotle's general point. The reason why people do bad things, even when they know it's not okay to do them, is because they're reacting not in response to what they know or think, but because of what they're afraid of, what gets them angry, and maybe pleasure and pain, which we haven't really dealt with. Do you think Aristotle's right?
Would it help to say that in the cases that you're talking about, I'm especially thinking about the fear of flying case, most people would say that the fear is impulsive. It's not something the person chooses. You don't say, I think I'll be afraid of planes right now.
Right.
The person, as you said, is just paralyzed, and it's an emotion, a passion, an impulse that wells up in the person. And I mean, this seems to be the standard way that Aristotle wants to think about this, is that rational control systems get overwhelmed by,
Yeah, I think so. That his general point is those rational control systems do get overwhelmed, if you want to put it that way, because of how we feel and think and respond to pleasure and pain and things of that kind. But here's just kind of to leap off that, here's the contrast, right? We don't all do that. Some people do, right? Some people react to their fear and their anger and pleasure and pain, but other people, maybe you and me, in similar situations, we respond rationally. Our rational faculties continue to operate as we expect. Most of us, if you're not afraid of flying, getting on an airplane is a fairly routine activity, even if it's risky. All right, so here's the question, and this is the question I'm trying to get us to kind of think about. Why is that some people give in to those non-rational feelings of fear and anger and pleasure and pain, and others don't? So just to kind of frame this for you a bit, for Aristotle, there's the weak person, the person who feels the fear, feels the anger, wants pleasure, wants to avoid pain, and chooses to give in to that, even when they believe that what they're doing is not okay. By contrast, there's what you might call the strong-willed person. This is just the exact opposite. This is a person who suffers from the same temptations, feels fear, feels anger, wants pleasure, wants to avoid pain, and does not give in. Why not? Why are some people strong-willed in that way, and why are other people weak-willed? Aristotle doesn't actually give us much of an explanation for that, except to say that we're all, because we're human beings, built in a certain way that we're still going to experience pleasure, pain, fear, etc. Those are just a natural fact about human life. And we always have to confront and deal with them. The question is how we confront and deal with them. So this, just kind of going back to what I said earlier, this is what I take to be the prevailing view. And I think your guys' answers suggest that most people, when you ask them a question like, why do people do bad things even when they know they're bad? The answer is almost always of the kind you guys have given. pleasure, pain, convenience. We're tempted to do things despite our knowledge, despite our beliefs, and we do them anyway. Not all of us, and not all the time, but a lot of the time and sometimes, right? It's the prevailing view, not just because it's common sense, but I would also suggest to you, given the context we're in here in the Socratic Society, that especially in our culture, it's already steeped because a lot of other traditions have embraced this view and sort of generally gone in different, slightly different direction, but we've seen variations of the same idea in other places. So the one example, I don't have time to go through all the different variations there are lots, but the big one I think that's going to loom large in this case is going to be Christian tradition. Right? Particularly the way Augustine of Hippo, if you're familiar with him, a Christian theologian from the 5th, 6th century, interprets sin. So in the Christian story, as Augustine understands it, you have an idea that he calls original sin and gets inherited by a lot of Christian traditions. And I think this is maybe my view a little bit, but my understanding is a lot of different variants of Christianity, a lot of different denominations, largely look at Augustine as the authority, whether they realize it or not, on how to understand this idea of sin. When Augustine gets his hands on Genesis, his interpretation of Genesis is that Adam and Eve, at the fall, were suffering from or had a tendency towards disobedience, which he interprets as the kind of sin that we then, as human beings, inherit from their behavior. Now, I submit to you that this is a variation on Aristotle's general theme. Built into human beings, at least as Christianity understands it, is a tendency to do things that we know are not okay. Right? If you know Genesis, then you'll know that Adam and Eve were instructed not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they did so anyway for various reasons, but they still gave in to that temptation. And just think about the heavy influence that Christianity has had on not just this culture, but on many cultures in the world. So whether Aristotle intended it or not, his view is the prevailing view for a lot of people. Let me just stop there for a second and get sort of your reactions. What do you think about this way of looking at human behavior? Do you think that Aristotle's basically correct? That human beings do bad things, and they know they're doing it, but they do it anyway because of reasons like the ones we've given, pleasure, pain, etc.? Or do you think there are problems or issues that Aristotle hasn't addressed? Remember, I think it's prevailing. Yeah, hold it.
I would just say that I think one thing that Aristotle doesn't necessarily consider is why, if things are inherently pleasurable or inherently painful, like eating steak for some people would not obviously be inherently pleasurable.
Sure.
That's one thing.
Okay, so eating steak is not inherently pleasurable. So let's think about it in terms of why people do bad things, right?
Okay.
Are you thinking about it as this person doesn't like steak, but you find them eating it anyway? Is that the scenario you're kind of envisioning here?
That could be a scenario. I think more so in the sense of like someone could not find something pleasurable, but then still undertake it. It's because they think it's the correct thing to do, for example, or vice versa. Someone could do something that they think is bad. And not find it inherently pleasurable for other extenuating circumstances that aren't necessarily their impulses.
Okay. So there it sounds like, and I could be misunderstanding you, it sounds like there isn't much of a conflict.
I guess so.
So a way of thinking about these types of people that Aristotle's talking about, a weak person who gives into their temptations, and a strong person who has those temptations but doesn't get into them, is they're conflicted. There's a conflict in them internally over what to do, and for the weak person, they give in to their as Aristotle might put it, they're baser instincts, right? They're those pleasure and pain and fear. But a strong-willed person refuses. But nevertheless, a strong-willed person is still conflicted. They still feel the temptation, right? So, is there a conflict there, as you see it?
I think there are times where people can do things that are bad and maybe they're not so internally conflicted about it. Sure.
Okay. So, what's an example?
So, like speeding on the highway is a good example of that. Like, I'm not really conflicted about going over the speed limit, even if I believe it could be a bad.
Could be, but how would you believe it could be? Isn't there a conflict there?
Yeah, I suppose there's a conflict, but it would be, yeah, I guess it would be a conflict of personal conscience versus.
Who feels bad about speeding? Be honest. Really, a little bit?
A little bit.
Okay. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. If there's a genuine conflict there, and this is, I think, the fundamental assumption Aristotle's making, if you feel conflicted about what you're doing, that's where we have to talk about why that people who believe things are bad do them anyway. But, you know, if you're speeding, and I'm not endorsing speeding, don't misunderstand me. If you don't feel bad about speeding, there's not the kind of conflict that we're really dealing with. Right? It's the fact that people believe, it's the fact that somebody might think, it's awful or wrong for me to speed, even 1 mile over the speed limit, and I'm gonna do it anyway. Why not? Who's gonna stop? That kind of attitude. Nick, did you want to say that?
Yeah, I guess now that we brought up like the conscience point of it, because I guess my question is like, yeah, so people do things that they think are bad, and for me I'm like, why? Like, is it actually bad objectively, or is it bad for the person based on their? So someone gave an example of like someone shoplifting, and I feel like there's a lot of times, and like sometimes the justice system in America does this, where like you try to make someone not do something and make them do that because you're going to bake on the fact that they fear like capital punishment or something like that, or like a prison sentence. And so I guess what I'm wondering with that is like how much of it's actually the morality, or does it just, I don't know if Aristotle's saying this, but do all of our like impulses to be ethical or whatever just reduce down to fear or pleasure? And then at that point, I think there might not even be a place to say what they see is good or bad, because it's really a more clear way to say it would just be what they would gain pleasure from or pain from.
It's very utilitarian.
Yeah, okay. Well, here, let's see if I'm getting at your question. So I've only talked here about 2 of the types of character that Aristotle really focuses on. I'll admit there are 2 others that we could talk about that are not the source of conflict. These are people who are not conflicted. All right? So if you're familiar with Aristotle, just bear with me for a second. In addition to the weak person and the strong person, there is the virtuous person or the good person, and the vicious or wicked person. And what's interesting for Aristotle about these people is they're not conflicted. There is no battle being waged in them about what to do. Now, for the virtuous person, that should make sense. They want to be good. They know what the right thing to do is, and they do it. And there's no temptation not to. That's how the virtuous person differs from somebody who's merely strong-willed. The strong-willed person still feels tempted to do the wrong thing. They just don't. The virtuous person doesn't even feel tempted. Moving? The wicked person is the same in a very important way. They're not conflicted either. The difference is they don't really know, according to Aristotle, what the right thing to do is. And I don't mean they don't know in the sense of like they're confused. They literally don't know. So their behavior could be anything. So they're not conflicted in the way you're talking about. They wouldn't even have that kind of conversation necessarily about what the right thing to do is. Does that make sense? I don't know if that gets you.
I'm not sure if Aristotle addresses this, but it does seem like the good that people are aiming for does change over time. So, for instance, in his will, Aristotle gives away a bunch of slaves. And so, like, most people today would say, enslaving people is 100% wrong. And he sees no moral quandary there.
Yeah, that's true. Historically, that's factually true. I don't know how Aristotle is going to address that, specifically, that specific issue. But if you wait, I have a different way of dealing with that. Can you hold off? Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Does Aristotle's theory make sense? You guys feel you have a general idea of how it works? Aristotle's theory has a lot of really kind of interesting implications that would apply in very interesting ways to our own modern day world. I don't want to address all of them, because again, there's lots of them, but there's a couple that I think are worth our attending to. One of them, and this is the one that is going to generate a lot of interest for me personally, is for Aristotle, if you're a strong-willed or weak-willed person, change is going to be easy in a way, but also really difficult. If you're a weak-willed person, if you struggle with doing the right thing even when you are tempted not to do it, the difficulty is going to be getting your desires and your feelings and your habits in order. Philosophers have historically been pretty pessimistic about whether or not you and I can change how we feel about things and what sort of things are pleasurable and painful. Some of it is just part of our biology, but even things like preferences, I'll just use that as an example. Okay? My favorite food is Mexican food. Why do you think my favorite food is Mexican? Here's what I didn't do. I did not sit down on my couch one afternoon and think very carefully about what my favorite food should be. And at the end of that thinking, said, you know what, it's going to be Mexican. And then from that point forward, I just had this urge. Does that sound ridiculous? It doesn't sound ridiculous? Oh, okay. I was trying to make it sound ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and Aristotle and most philosophers think it's ridiculous. That's not how we make decisions, or that's not how things like preferences and habits are generated. When you want to adopt a habit that you don't already have, what do you have to do? Take exercise. Every year in January, people adopt a resolution to take up exercise, and they sign up for a gym, and within a week, they have a gym membership for 3 years, and they don't use it. Why does that happen? Is it weak will? Is it that they can't stick to their resolutions? They've resolved to change their life. In a kind of trivial but important way, right? They've resolved to do this. Why don't people who stick to this resolution do that?
New habits are incredibly hard to form, especially as you age.
Yeah. Right. They're very hard to, they require practice, they require effort. You can't just sit down one day and do it and decide this is what I'm going to do, and then you'll stick to it. It's not that simple. Changing your habits, changing your preferences, changing your desires is difficult. But for Aristotle and his view, if you want to be a better person, if you want to be a strong-willed person who can do the things you know are good and avoid the things you know are bad and not accidentally do them, you have to be able to change your desires. And it turns out that that's probably not so easy to do. Another implication, and this is the one that matters the most to me personally, but I hope you will see why it's valuable, is that Aristotle's view implies that human beings sometimes want bad things. That we don't want good things, we want bad things. We know they're bad and we want them. Do you agree with that? Shall I do a poll? How many of you agree with that? If you feel a trap coming, you're right, there's a trap coming, but no? Can you see why his view would imply that? If the question is, why do people do things they know are bad, even though they know they're bad, then at some level, because they're interested in pleasure and expressing their anger or giving into their fear, at some level they're pursuing things they believe are bad. They know they're bad and they want them. That's what his view seems to suggest to us. And if you believe that's true, then you're going to probably, I think, find Aristotle's view appealing, and that's going to be how you would look at what other people do. Think back to that example I asked you to consider. When you think of a case of yourself observing when someone else does something that you think they know is bad, how do you, from your vantage point, explain why they did it? Aristotle's answer is going to be, they did it because they wanted to do a bad thing. That's not the only option. And keep in mind, this is what I take to be the prevailing view. Prevailing for common sense, but also in the history of philosophy and other things. The alternative comes from Aristotle's teacher, Plato. Plato did not agree that human beings ever want bad things, ever. No one wants a bad thing. So I'm going to read. I don't do PowerPoint, so I'm sorry I don't have it up here for you. So if you'll just follow along, I'm going to read a passage, an exchange that Plato wrote between Socrates and a general named Meno. Some of you will have read this dialogue maybe. Socrates is speaking. Do you assume, Meno, that there are people who desire bad things and others who desire good things? Do you not think, my good man, that all men desire good things? All human beings desire good things. I do not. But some desire bad things? Yeah. Meno says. Do you mean that those people believe the bad things to be good, or that they know they are bad and nevertheless desire them anyway? I think there are both kinds, Meno says. Socrates. Do you think, Meno, that anyone knowing that bad things are bad nevertheless desires them? I certainly do. What do you mean by desiring, Meno? Is it to secure for oneself something they want? Something that, some sort of property? What else? Does that person think that the bad things benefit them? That they're good for them, who possess them? Or does that person know that bad things cause harm? There are some who believe that the bad things benefit them, that they're good for them. Others who know that the bad things do them harm. And do you think that those who believe that bad things benefit them know that those things are bad? No, that I cannot altogether believe. It is clear then, Meno, that those who do not know things to be bad do not desire what is bad, but they desire those things that they believe to be good, but that are in fact bad. It follows that that those who have no knowledge of these things and believe them to be good clearly desire good things. Is that not so? It is likely. Well then, those who you say desire bad things, believing that bad things harm them, know that they will be harmed by them? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, necessarily that's what I'm saying. And do you not think, Meno, that those who are harmed are miserable to the extent that they are harmed by those things? That too is inevitable. And that those who are miserable are unhappy? I think so. Does anyone in the world wish to be miserable and unhappy? I don't think so, Socrates. No one then wants what is bad, Meno, unless he wants to be such a person. For what else is being miserable but to desire bad things and to get them? You're probably right, Socrates, and no one wants what is bad. No one wants what is bad. Now, I find this argument very compelling. I don't think it's conclusive, but I think there is a strong case here to be made that people, everyone, and I stress that, everyone wants what's good. Everyone. No one wants bad things. The key to understanding, I think, passages like this goes back to the questions I asked you at the beginning. When you think about what you want for yourself and your own behavior, how do you interpret your own behavior? When you think about how other people behave, how do you interpret their behavior? When you see other people doing bad things, how do you read into what their motivations are? When you think about yourself being caught out doing something bad, how do you interpret your own motivations? That's exactly what Socrates asks Meno to do here. What does the person, let's call this person the agent, the person who does the action, what does the person doing the action think the goal is? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing, according to Meno, ultimately. Why would somebody think that any human being wants a bad thing, as far as Meno is concerned? Because they're looking at it from an outsider's point of view. They're observing things from the point of view of somebody who sees another person doing a bad thing, so therefore they must want bad things. If you ask yourself whether a person in that situation, thinking about why they're doing it, does it, what are they going to tell you? What is the agent, the person who does it, going to tell you? Why did they do it? They thought it was good. All right. Buy it? Or you can, I find this argument compelling. You might not. I have not convinced Jeannie. She's shaking her head. That's okay. Like I said, I don't think that this is going to be compelling, and I'll come back to this issue. I don't think that this is going to be the kind of conclusive argument we would love to hear about why people choose to behave in the way that they do. With me? But here's the question that I started with again. If Socrates is right, if Meno and Socrates are correct, that no person wants to do bad things, then why do people do bad things knowing they're bad? Back to the question. So we had Aristotle's answer. They do it because of pleasure and anger and fear. Well, what's Socrates' answer? I'm going to read something else. This comes from a dialogue called the Protagoras. Socrates is speaking to Protagoras. Protagoras is a famous, if you're not familiar with him, he's a famous, in his day, what we now call a sophist. He was a famous teacher. He made tons of money teaching people to be clever at basically speech. By one account, he made something like $250,000 a day. He was that good. I don't know if that's true, but you know, archaeology and all that. Socrates is talking to Protagoras and he says, what do you think, Protagoras, about knowledge? Do you go along with the majority of people? Most people think this about knowledge, that it is not a powerful thing. Neither a leader nor a ruler. They do not think of knowledge in that way at all, but rather in this way. While knowledge is often present in a person, what rules him is not knowledge, but rather anything else. Anger, pleasure, pain, fear, love, not knowledge. They think of knowledge as being utterly dragged around by all these other things, as if knowledge were a slave to their feelings and desires. Now, does the matter seem that way to you, Protagoras, or does it seem to you that knowledge is a beautiful and noble thing, capable of governing a person? And if someone were to know what is good and what is bad, then he would not be forced by anything to act otherwise than knowledge dictates. And intelligence would be sufficient to save a person's life. You see what Socrates is suggesting here? Why do people do bad things when they know they're bad? Because they don't really know. They're confused. They're misled. They don't know what they're doing. They don't really understand why it is that what they're doing is bad. Yeah, what's your name?
Rosa.
Rosa, sorry. Yes.
Why do you ask that question? I haven't very long answer. said fetus to them, it is good always or just at that moment. They do what's good for them and don't think of others or consequences in that way.
Okay, yeah. Now, why wouldn't they do that? You're right.
Why?
Well, think about consequences, right? I think you're absolutely right. Socrates will make this point in a different dialogue. But when people make mistakes, which I'm going to come back to, and they misjudge a situation, they think they know what they're doing, but they don't anticipate the sort of consequences that they should have expected, right? They didn't think it through. So what was the problem? Was the problem what they wanted? Was the problem their desires, their feelings? Their problem was they didn't think it through. They didn't understand what was bad and what the consequences of doing it were. So I take it you're supporting Socrates' point. So just to kind of recap, in case we're lost, I know I'm sure your head's spinning, some of you, that's just philosophy, sorry. We have Aristotle. Why do people do bad things when they know they're bad? Because of how they feel and because of temptations like pleasure and pain. They want to avoid pain, they want to pursue pleasure, they get angry, they are afraid, and they don't respond appropriately. For Socrates and Plato, why do people do bad things when they know they're bad? Because they don't really understand what is good and what is bad. The problem is a problem of knowledge and education, not a problem of how you feel or what your habits or character is, according to Socrates. I was hoping that would be more shocking. You're overwhelmed. Okay, Nick brought this up, so I'm just going to come back to this. There's some really weird, and some of you won't find these comfortable implications of Socrates' view. So first, if you are a person who wants to change your life, and let's say Plato's right, that the problem is what you know, not what you feel, then how do you change? You got to get thinking. You got to take some philosophy classes. Sorry, shameless plug there, but you have to sit down and think about really hard what is good and bad. And what that means is you might be wrong. You might make a mistake. Now, I think the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is that if that's correct, if Plato is right about that, that means that good and bad are not a matter of personal individual opinion. They're not subjective. There are objective, independent standards of what is good and bad. I don't know what they are, I'm not telling you what they are, but they're out there somewhere and we have to find them if we want to improve our life. We have to understand better what those standards are. Do you like that? My experience as a teacher, not a lot of students like it.
Well,
yes, what's your name?
Kelly,
Kelly.
I do like it, and
Okay.
I agree with Augustine in the earlier discussion.
You agree with Augustine in the earlier discussion?
Yeah, so there would be a biblical reason for their objective morality.
So the command,
Yeah.
or at least in Genesis, the command God issues to them to, hey, stay away from that tree. It's not good.
I was trying to think of an example of somebody doing something bad that gave them no pleasure. Even a thief might steal to get fed.
Sure.
But there is the tendency to suicide and self-harm, which is unexplainable almost.
Yeah, so those are good. I was trying to stay away from really dicey things,
Well,
but that's okay.
I was thinking.
I didn't want to get really worked up about that, but do you think, are you suggesting, or do you think that the two sort of explanations I've shared with you wouldn't be able to account for why a person might find themselves in that situation where they feel compelled to end their life?
I think they're a little weak.
Okay. So you think Aristotle would do a better job explaining why?
He needed to learn more.
Okay, that's it. That's Plato's
Augustine.
answer.
From Augustine.
Sure. Okay. Yes.
So, I mean, I'm sympathetic to Plato's explanation, but, so you started us off with there are philosophers who believe there's no good reason to eat meat, and yet they eat meat. And like, surely these are like, reasonably well-educated people, they know about factory farming, they know about, the terrible conditions animals and things like that, and yet they persisted. And it seems like that there is a reasonably good amount of knowledge there. Is it just that like you can't like go into the mind of like a cow that's dying, and so that's you can't reach the level of knowledge that you would need there, or is it like what kind of knowledge would suffice in that situation?
That's a good question. The way Socrates and the way Plato conceive of knowledge, and this is not going to answer your question completely, or at least it's not going to deal with the vegetarian not eating meat part. Plato and Socrates, at least in this context, think of knowledge like a skill. Okay, I'll give you a dumb example. I am a son of a carpenter, so I should know a lot of things about carpentry. And I do know some things about carpentry. I know enough to think that I can probably fix stuff in my own home and do a reasonably decent job and fail most of the time. You know, I fix my own plumbing, which is a terrible idea, don't recommend it. But I'm not a plumber. What's the difference between me and a professional plumber? I know how they work, generally. I've read books, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos. Here's the difference, here's one difference. And this is going to be related to what we're talking about. I can fix my toilet. I can fix my shower because I know my house. But if you ask me to come over to your apartment or your house for me to fix your toilet or your shower, good luck. I'm not probably going to succeed. Why am I not going to succeed? I'm not a professional plumber. I have a kind of knowledge that allows me, gives me the ability, the know-how to do some kind of work. But I'm not a professional in the sense where I can just go to anyone's house where I will deal with very different situation, with different conditions and different people, different structures, all kinds of different factors that are relevant to my success fixing plumbing. I can't account for all those differences, right? A professional can do that. So what does that tell you? I know enough, but I know some, but I'm not the kind of expert. Think of this situation of what to do with good and bad in a similar way. That's what we're sort of being invited to do. Think of knowing the right thing to do in a given situation in the same way you think about a plumber, seeing what's going on in a particular bathroom and having to figure out just by inspection what's going on. For Plato, the expert in goodness and badness is going to know how to respond to various situations and circumstances in the same way a plumber or any expert in any field would be able to do. What do you think? Is he on to something?
I mean, so it seems like the answer's suggesting that, like, you know, most people have insufficient expertise in determining what is good in lots of different situations. Yeah. And that, like, the type, I don't know, it still seems like the type of training that you would need to get that type of mastery is really unclear. Like, you know, for a plumber, there's, you know, a pretty clear course of study.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. Knowing what good and bad is, yeah, that's a guy. That's the point, I think. That's harder than, you know, no knock on plumbers. Learning what good and bad is a lot harder than learning how to do plumbing. And I think Socrates is admitting that. But you're still sort of making his same point, which is the reason we fail, the reason we do bad things when we know, even when we know they're bad, is because we don't know what's bad well enough. So what about philosophers and their tendency to eat meat when they know they shouldn't or when they think they shouldn't? I would suggest to you, and I kind of think this is true, that philosophers who have this sort of argument, they generally don't really think it's wrong, even if they can't find an argument to justify themselves. That's the way I think Socrates would look at it. All right. Last point. So, I've given you two sort of ways of looking at human behavior and human motivation. You have Aristotle's view and Plato's view. Aristotle's view has sort of won the day in terms of influence, I think. But I haven't probably convinced you, I know I haven't convinced Jeannie, that Plato's right and that Aristotle's wrong. And I didn't expect to do that, and that's, I think, because at the end of the day, what we're really dealing with here are just basic assumptions. Plato can't prove that everybody wants what's good, and the reason they fail is because they don't understand it well enough. And his argument that I read from Meno doesn't prove it. It proves it to Meno, but it doesn't prove it necessarily to everybody else. But Aristotle similarly can't prove that the reason people do bad things is because they really want to do bad things, or because they're just given into temptation. He's assuming something there as well. And it might strike you and me as more reasonable to make that assumption, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's more right than Plato, or for that matter, anyone else. So I don't think I've convinced you. But in closing, let me just give you a couple of my own reasons for why I favor Plato here over Aristotle. First reason is Plato's view of human beings is optimistic, and maybe too optimistic, but optimistic. It might be hard to learn what good and bad is, but think about what I was saying about how we change our behavior. It's difficult to change what we desire. It's difficult to change our habits. It requires practice and work and effort. That's why so many people fail to keep their New Year's resolutions. That's why addiction for a lot of people, right, people in recovery programs, is difficult. Because it's not simply for them understanding something, it's they have to get into their feelings and their emotions and how they respond to difficult situations. If Plato's right, it's easier. The desires are in place. They want the good things, but they have to understand what's good and what's bad, which isn't easy either, but it might be easier than trying to change your character, especially if you're like me and a little older and those habits are established. The other reason, and this is a little bit more complicated, it goes back to the opening question. When people think about why other people, like when you think about why other people behave in the way that they do, and they give you a response that you don't believe, oh, I thought what I was doing was good. I had good intentions. You have to basically tell them that you know better than they do about what their own motivations are. And you might be right, but right there you've driven a wedge between you and other people. You have your judgment about why they did what they did, and they have their own, and they think they have to be in a position to say what their motivations are, because it's their motivation. Plato's view doesn't drive that wedge. You can believe when somebody says that their intentions were good, even if they failed, that they probably were good. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Hope I didn't go too long.
Well, this has been interactive already, but Professor Bagwell will answer questions that we can actually develop some of these ideas a little further. So,
thank you.
Feel free to entertain.
Tear me down. Yeah. Thank you.
So you had mentioned that Plato, and I guess like Plato through Socrates, believed an objective, I don't know, like ethics or morality.
Yep.
The idea is that you gain this like knowledge of it. So I feel like, okay, sure.
Sure.
And then I think the Aristotle thing, you mentioned, yeah, people do what is bad because it's fun, or because it's pleasurable, or because it's avoiding pain. And then I'm thinking like, so there's things that are good that are painful for Aristotle. Is that correct?
So,
That there could be
yes.
things that are good that would, like you should do the good things even though there might be pain. Yeah. So even for Aristotle, there's this view of something objective. Is that correct? Okay.
Yep, they're on the same page on that. I didn't go into a lot of detail here. Both Plato and Aristotle are going to tell you, like a lot of philosophers, that pleasure is a good thing. Pain is a bad thing. But sometimes there are good things that come from pain, right? Running marathons. Who likes to run marathons? Okay, 1%. Yeah, I mean, running marathons, training for a marathon is painful and stressful, right? but it's a pain that a lot of people think is worth it, right? Even knowing that the first person who ran a marathon dropped dead at the end of it, they still want to do it because there's an achievement there. Do you guys not know this? This is just history here. The guy who ran, it's called a marathon because in ancient Greece, when the Persians invaded Greece, this is like a Paul Revere moment where a guy ran from Marathon, which is a city in central Greece, to Athens, which is how long? 26 point, yeah, exactly. And he didn't prepare for that run. So he died when he arrived. Or at least that's the story we're told. But the point is, like, even the pain of training is worth it, right? Because there's a greater goal and a greater pleasure in the achievement. So for Plato and Aristotle, they're unequivocal that pleasure is a good thing. It's just not the only good thing. There's other good things. The mistake is of people like what are called hedonists who think that only pleasure is good and only pain is bad. That's a mistake, according to them. Is that?
Yeah, it seems like, and maybe I'm just like, attacking this example because there's probably like a lot more examples. But the marathon that you do, even though it's painful, and then I guess I forgot like what the good thing that would happen after the marathon. What was that like?
The achievement.
The achievement. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
It would be the achievement of crossing the finish line after all that effort and work, and the feeling of euphoria that you presumably feel as a result of doing that massive undertaking.
I guess for me, it's hard to distinguish that idea of like an objective good of running the marathon, and then it's painful, but then you get the achievement, which is also objectively good. And trying to distinguish that from like an ends justify the means kind of thing, where it's like, yeah, the achievement is good, and the marathon, it hurts to run it,
Sure.
but like, it's not really like an objective or like it's just something you do to get to the other thing. So it feels like that even that whittles down just to the pleasure.
That's it, yeah. And it is a very good question. I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but Aristotle recognizes, particularly Aristotle recognizes that people who are weak-willed, who give in to their temptations, are still smart people. They're just misusing their intelligence to some degree. They're clever, as he puts it, not intelligent. Clever because they're good at picking the right way to achieve their goal, but their goal is a bad goal. They shouldn't do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of, like, here's an example from my own life. I had some friends. I knew some people. I shouldn't say they're friends. I knew some people in college who would go and give donate plasma on Friday afternoon. Can you guess why? And then they'd spend the plasma money on a six-pack and be drunk after one beer. That's bad thinking. I submit to you, right? But it achieves their goal. That's their goal. And it's not a great goal necessarily, right? Yeah. Maybe I should have brought that up. Ashley.
My question is about deception of the good.
Okay.
So if someone is going to deceive someone else about what is good, wouldn't they necessarily have to have knowledge of what is good in order to deceive someone else about what is good? And
Very good question.
deception, we usually agree, is a bad thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think Plato and Aristotle would agree. And Aristotle in particular is very explicit about this. Somebody who, and he gives examples of like doctors. Plato does too, actually. Who's really excellent at healing people? Physicians. Who's really excellent at poisoning people? Physicians. Why? They're very skilled at healing, so they understand why healing is effective. But if they use their intelligence for bad, potentially they could do some very efficient bad.
Well, could they, if they knew what was good? If they have this.
What do you mean, could they? Sorry.
So if someone had, within this model, right, someone is pure into absolute need, and they have this divine knowledge of what is objectively good, can one then deceive someone else about what is objectively good, if that is an objectively bad action under this one?
So I'll go out on a limb here and say I don't think they would say that you can't. Because if you know what, or at least Plato, if you know what the good is, then that's just not going to be an option.
Right.
You're not going to even entertain it.
Right.
Whether you buy that or not has a lot to do with whether you think Aristotle's explanation of human behavior is the right one, or whether you think what Plato's up to is the right one. Whether it's because we don't understand what good and bad is, or whether because our desires are all messed up. Thanks, Ash. Yeah, hold.
So you have to walk with me here a little bit.
All right, I'll walk. Yeah.
But I think you could make a compatibilist view of these two things a little bit. You could say, on the one hand, we have impulsive desire. On the one hand, we have a misunderstanding, leading to doing things that we can't do that. Now, if you wanted to, could you say that understanding is the root of impulsive desires? So if we define understanding as habitual perception or experience of a thing, and then habitual interpretation of that experience.
Okay.
So then we'd say that it's basically habit-based, and that it leads to a kind of impulsive desire. You taste the ice cream for the first time, you think it's amazing, you come back and you have an impulsive desire for ice cream. So then wouldn't that be both? Where on the one hand you have to change it, you both have to change your habits, but also your understanding.
Yeah, potentially. I can see the attempt to be compatible here. And there's, if we went deeper in Aristotle, he does kind of want to sound like Plato at times. I kind of suggested this when I was talking about the vicious person and the virtuous person. The virtuous person does know the right thing to do, and there's no conflict. The issue is the conflict. When you feel that internal conflict between what you want and what you know, how do you reconcile those? The reason Plato does what he does is because he thinks in those conflicts, you can't avoid involving your knowledge, what you think and what you know about what you're doing in that decision. You can't just act on habit. Habit's there too, but you can't just act. Thinking is there, inescapable. You buy that?
Kind of. I think about if we think about moving our hand away from the flame, and that's something that happens without your brain necessarily, your spinal cord can do that, then maybe that's something where there are scenarios where we move purely based on sort of habit created by evolution or something like that, rather than thinking and habit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wish I had more to say. Anyone else? Yeah.
I mean, for Plato, knowledge isn't presupposed by desire, right? So I would disagree with Holden because he's kind of initially at least he had this account where it was desire and knowledge both in the same thing. Where I would say desire comes first, and then teaching ourselves what we should desire through greater knowledge is what leads to us having a moral understanding or a better moral worldview, right? And then also there's also the fact in the divided line I forget the Greek word, is it doxa?
Mm-hmm.
So opinion is the first thing, so we don't have a complete knowledge there. So eventually we get to a more and more complete knowledge. So I don't think knowledge is not presupposed, especially if we consider our wrongdoing. I would agree that we just don't have a complete knowledge of what is actually good.
Right.
Because I think also in both thinkers there's kind of this idea that if you tend to think what is good, what is pleasurable is what is good, as we said, but also what is expedient in the situation as well. So we have a tendency to conflate those two. But I guess for Plato, the account would be, or Plato and Socrates, the account would be what is always good, absolute good, I guess. I'm just basically,
can I give you I think that's exactly right. I don't know that there's really any disagreement between what you and Holden did.
I was just thinking.
I would suggest, and I want to be cautious about an example like this, but think of people in recovery. People like alcoholics who attend AA, right? Okay, so those people have already made a kind of progress, right? The first step in the 12-step program is admit you have a problem. Well, there's a lot that goes into that, and that's what Plato's driving at. They have to have this sort of self-knowledge to be able to admit to themselves that they need to change their behavior. It's not easy after that, but if people are going into recovery simply because all of the people they care about think they should, that's just acting on other people's opinions. That's what he's driving at with doxa, right? Is that going to get people to change? Not for Plato, right? They don't really know what they're doing. They don't really believe that what they're doing is good yet. Hopefully they will. but they have to reach a certain state of knowledge to understand that what they're doing is bad for them. And Aristotle, I would say, has a harder time explaining why that's the process. I'm not saying he can't. I mean, the advantage of both theories is that they do a pretty good job of explaining what the facts of human life look like. But maybe they don't do it as effectively.
I was actually thinking of the addiction example. It seems that Aristotle has the upper hand here because he acknowledges or emphasizes even that the problem, or at least the standard way of understanding, let me put it that way, the standard way of understanding the addict's problem is a problem of impulse control. And I mean, I'm wondering, I was trying to think of a non-cheeky way to ask this question, but I mean, what would a Platonic, Socratic addiction recovery program look like? If you say that what a person's problem, and the reason I'm thinking it's going to end up sounding cheeky is because maybe I'm thinking in too abstract terms. If the failure is a failure of knowledge, it seems like all you have to do is, well, you have to provide the knowledge, but of course you have to get the agent, in this case the addict, to be properly receptive to the knowledge as well, right? So there's that problem. But even that, it seems like, wait, to say that we need to get the addict properly receptive to the knowledge means, aren't we dealing with impulses again, right? So I'm just curious what you would say, because it sounds like, if the way I've sketched it out is correct, Aristotle has a much better account of what's going wrong.
Yeah,
and
so
what would be effective in dealing with the problem is, you've got an impulse,
right.
It's an impulse that you know is an impulse, you're aware of the fact that it's an impulse, so what do you have to do? Well, we've got a character habit issue that has to do with how think about a classic way of talking about, how your rational functions of governance deal with the part of you that can be controlled by rationality, right?
Yeah. So
what's the Platonic?
You want the therapy view? You want?
Yes.
My first answer, well, as you were talking, my first answer was like, I don't know that Aristotle, Plato in particular, would really change what recovery programs already look like AA. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing you would expect. A community of people, all in support of one another, trying to deal with recovery and addiction, but talking it through. Sort of a therapeutic way in that fashion. So I don't know if it would be fundamentally different. However, my second answer would be something like, I think Plato would have people like addicts go to college. I'm serious. Instead of focusing on their addiction, focusing on the issue of what's good about life, what's bad about life, and let's sort that out. And again, that's not easy to do, but get them away from that thinking. That doesn't address the point about the inclination, I think. The fundamental point I think Plato would want to make, and I want to make too, is you're not going to get anywhere with anybody if it's just impulse control. They have to at least reach a level of understanding of themselves to be able to say, this is something I need to work on. You'll just never succeed, and that's why I don't...
Aristotle would agree with that, right? I mean, this is a point where you rightly pointed out a moment ago that there are many respects in which Aristotle and Plato are going to share a fundamental agreement. And I wonder if this is a case where their theoretical differences aren't going to cash out in a significantly different way of...
I think that's true, yeah. I don't think, at the end of the day, they're not. I think the difference will ultimately be this. I think Aristotle's view leads us, and this is another implication, to the idea that some people can't save. And maybe I just don't want to believe that, so maybe this is just me, but Plato's view does not think that. I don't think he believes that anyone is hopeless. And the reason he doesn't think anyone is hopeless is because everybody wants what's good. You always can hold out hope that you can save a person because they have that fundamental desire. If you believe that if you believe that anybody wants something that's bad, you have to allow for the possibility that there's some people who, as Aristotle suggests at times, the only thing you can do with them is exile them or kill them. You will not be able to save them, and they're going to do a lot of harm to people, so you've got to get them out of there. That's a very pessimistic view of human nature, and I'm not sure I like that. But that's just a preference. Maybe it's like my Mexican food preference. Don?
Over the years, I've dealt with students who've had addiction problems and helped them. And I don't know much about the processes, but I know that there are some, I'm not much with psychology either, but psychological treatment, I guess that's the commonplace. But there's also some kind of rational drug addiction treatment. So it seems to me that even in our society, we have approaches to addiction problems that are geared more towards the emotional and more towards the rational. And they work different and better for different people, different characters.
I don't want to suggest that Plato, even though he thinks it's really a knowledge problem that we're struggling with, doesn't recognize that anger and pleasure and pain are still involved here. But they're just not what causes the problem, he thinks. So I would suspect he's going to tell us that emotional, cognitive behavioral therapy is limited, and stuff like that.
Might be for him.
It's definitely for him, yeah. I mean, that's a way to test, right? Maybe scientifically we find out that Plato just has got this all wrong. No one else want to tear me down? All right, thank you very much. Appreciate you guys all coming. Thanks, David.
Certainly. I do want to let you know, I hope you'll come back to other events of the Socratic Club. This fall, we have lined up in October. The Socratic Club is co-sponsoring a talk in the Faith, Film, and Philosophy series, and Dr. Brian Clayton will be doing a talk on the films of M. Night Shyamalan, titled I See Dead People, Spiritual Quests in the Films of M. Night Shyamalan. We have a talk scheduled for November the 4th, but I can't yet tell you what it is because of the university's rules, but it's going to exist. And then in December, we have Anthony Clark from Whitworth University is going to talk to us about Jesuit Theater and Canonization, China Saints and the Western Enlightenment. That's a complex title to say. He's going to talk to us about Jesuit evangelism in China. So it should be a fascinating talk. If you don't know about the Socratic Club, the easiest way to find out this information, just do a Google search, Gonzaga Socratic Club. You'll find the website, and there's a place there to sign up for information on our listserv. So hope we'll see you again. Thanks again for coming. Have a great night.